The Sutherland Lecture seeks to platform significant research that speaks prophetically to the local churches, pastors and scholars involved in Baptist life in Aotearoa. This year, Martin Sutherland presents Kept Apart by Creeds, the 1923 Act of Incorporation in the context of division. His lecture explores what divides us and why we're still together, asking those big bite questions about how we handle difference and reflecting on the Act of Incorporation and what that means in our constitutional basis, all comes into this story. Note this episode was recorded at the Sutherland Lecture Breakfast at the Baptist National Hui 2023 and includes Q&A at the end. These are in low audio quality.
One or two personal notes before I start the paper. I've been reflecting on how, now that I'm old, you reflect on your life, and I realise how fortunate I have been in my academic and scholarly career, particularly. And there's a number of factors in that which I think are worth noting. Firstly, I'm immensely fortunate to have been married to Yvonne. Yesterday was our 44th wedding anniversary, which means that in August this year was 48 years since we first held hands. It was the 6th of August, and it was in Greendale Road in Darfield, and we were on one of those things towards the end of a term where the school teachers don't know what to do with you, so they just send you on a big walk. So the whole class went down one street and back up the other. And we left as friends and we returned as lovers. But Yvonne has always given me permission to explore and to become the person that I was able to become. And she was willing to put up with someone who was perpetually distracted and looking into the middle distance during the evenings, and not so good on the conversation. But also I need to note that she was a person herself well ahead of the curve on bicultural matters. And so 30 years ago she began a study in Maori language, which led to her having a PhD in classical Maori translation. And she, of course, is unable to be at events like this these days, and that's a great tragedy for us. But she would have loved what Hui has become, and I'm grateful for her and what she's given me. I'm grateful too for the fact that when I arrived at Baptist College on the staff, I looked into the library and realised we had this enormous, essentially untapped archive, and so it opened up for me as essentially at that point the only person working at an academic level in the study of Baptist history, an enormous rich resource which has enabled me to publish all sorts of things which just brought to light some of the stories, and I still regard it as being largely untapped. I think there's enormous potential for Baptist stories to be developed. I'm fortunate too that I was there at a point where we could start the New Zealand Journal of Baptist Research, just to get the title right, Andrew, which was an incredibly presumptuous thing to do, really. I mean, we had nothing to do it on, but when I looked out into the marketplace, I could see that there was almost no secondary literature on Baptists in New Zealand, so we had to start publishing. So my children and I would be down there on a Saturday afternoon photocopying and folding every single page and sheet of that document and taking it to binders and getting it done. And those were great days. And then ultimately when I dreamed the idea of turning the New Zealand Baptist magazine into a digital word searchable form, I was very fortunate that the principal had just retired and was willing to do all the hard work. So to Brian Smith, I give tribute as well. And it's from that the pages of the New Zealand Baptist that we see the public debates, the open debates that Baptists were having. And that's one of those that I want to highlight in today's lecture. So the title, as you know, is Kept Apart by Creeds, the 1923 Act of Incorporation in the context of division. And I hope that becomes clear. Conflict and connection have been a thing I've been very interested in as I've looked at New Zealand Baptists. What is it that divides us, and why is it that we're still together? So this centripetal and centrifugal forces both at work, and I've been quite fascinated by that, and that became the title of my 2011 book on the subject, which, if you want a copy, can be found on tables outside second-hand bookshops all over the country. But to look at this particular one seems to me appropriate to this year, when we're asking those big bite questions about how do we handle difference in our own midst. And we've been reflecting on and we're still got some reflecting to do on the Act of Incorporation itself and what that means and our constitutional basis. All of those things come into this story, and I hope that these aspects of it are illuminating. In July 1907, Reverend N.A. Davis outlined in the New Zealand Baptist his vision for, quote, the place Baptists should occupy in the religious life of New Zealand. Now, Davis was an American who'd had a notable career as an evangelist in Australia before arriving in New Zealand in 1905. He filled various pulpits in Auckland, including an early connection with my former church at Epsom. And he would later return to the United States in 1909. So he wasn't here long. But the place of Baptists, in Davis' view, was as uniquely focused proponents of the central spiritual principle of freedom. Articles of faith and such like, those are the things which divide Christians, he argued, adding unhelpful superstructure to the foundational principle that Christ died to make us free. So here's a quote from him, 2 quotes from him. We are not kept apart by differing principles, but by articles of faith, confessions, disciplines, creeds, and trust deeds that are daily ceasing to bind the consciences of souls emancipated into the liberty of truth. Daily ceasing to bind the consciences of souls emancipated into the liberty of truth. He saw them as passing away. And this is actually a little bit of a feature of Baptist thinking in the first 2 centuries of the Western world. Baptists were very confident at this time. They thought they were taking over the world. And by 1920, this reached its peak because they were able to identify the Prime Minister of Britain, Lloyd George, and the newly elected President of the United States, Warren Harding, as being Baptists. Now, if you know anything about those 2 gentlemen, you know they were hitching their wagon to the wrong horses. But the Baptists genuinely thought that their way was becoming the way all Christians would think. So this is our testimony. No presbytery, no clergyman, no formality of doctrine, no ecclesiastical court may stand between the individual conscience and God. Gospel liberty, we say, is the seed of life, of progress, of human right and divine order. Not license we contend for, but freedom from trammel in the pursuit of righteousness. The will of God, as apprehended by the individual soul and the segregated church, is supreme, and from it there is no court of appeal. Now, when he says segregated here, he's not meaning segregated in the Southern Baptist sense, but he's meaning autonomous or independent rather than racially segregated. Some bright day, Davis dared to hope. Some bright day, Christians will unite, and when that comes, we shall have an evangelical church with the dignity of Presbyterianism, the fire of Methodism, the culture of Congregationalism, the aggressiveness of the disciples, but Baptist in its principles. Now, Davis was advocating a particular strand of American Baptist thought, which would be codified by his contemporary E.Y. Mullins as soul competency, the competency of the individual soul. The individual's right to religious conscience was, in this view, the defining essence of Baptist witness. Importantly, Davis contended that baptism by adult immersion was a mere reflection of this principle, not the foundational principle itself. And this was evidenced, in his view, by the fact that, quote, some of our largest and most influential churches are not only open communion, but open membership, receiving members simply upon credible evidence of conversion and profession of faith in Jesus Christ. Now, Davis was interpreting the existence of open membership churches as a sign of New Zealand Baptists' underpinning unity around the principle of freedom. Now, he was right, but at the same time, egregiously wrong. A controversy was about to break on this very question of open membership, and it would last 20 years and remain unresolved when it was eventually overtaken by other disputes in the late 1920s. Less than 6 months after Davis's confident manifesto, the new editor of the New Zealand Baptist, H. Driver, was noting that controversy about open membership had broken out in Victoria in Australia, and that, quote, the question is sure to come up for discussion in this Dominion also, and will certainly divide our camp into two parties, with eager disputants on either side. That's January 1908. Well, Driver didn't have to wait long. In May 1907, the Wanganui Church issued a call to the already notable Arthur Samuel Wilson of Perth. Wilson had been a key figure in the establishment of Baptist work in Western Australia and a highly effective evangelist, and he was, crucially, married to Annie Mead and was thus son-in-law of Silas Mead of Adelaide, a missionary activist and vigorous proponent of open membership. Wilson, by this time 40, was in the most powerful phase of his long ministry career. He arrived at Wanganui in September 1907, and by January 1908, the church had confirmed a shift to open membership. Now, Wilson outlined the argument for this move in the March Baptist of that year. His case makes an interesting comparison to that of Davis. Davis rested on what I'm calling an American argument based on the freedom of the individual. It was an essentialist, anthropological, soteriological argument. Now, Wilson too relied on an essentialist argument, that is, from the very nature of the gospel, but his was Mead's Australian argument, which was Christological in focus. And he outlines this in the Baptist in the following ways, and the key passages are these ones. Firstly, the church is Christ's, not ours. If it is his church, he alone must have supreme control, and therefore barriers for the exclusion of Christians from the Lord's table or the Lord's church should be raised only by his clear and definite sanction. First point. Second point goes even deeper. Scripture shows only one foundation for the Christian church, 1 Corinthians 3:11, for other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. If really the church's one foundation is Jesus Christ her Lord, it is surely not right to make one of the truths that surround his blessed person to take the place he alone should occupy. It is possible to unduly exalt any doctrine. When we speak of Christ being the foundation, we mean his personal and indispensable work for the human race. Let important secondary documents come next, if you will, but the one basis is the finished work of Christ on the cross and the resurrection. He lives as the head of all the members. We gather round not a particular truth, but a glorious person. Our relationship to one another depends not on our assent to this or that truth or ordinance, but on our relationship to our common head. Now, if any of you did Theology of Mission 1 with me, would know about centered sets and such like, and this is the sort of thing he's talking about. Thirdly, the open membership, this is still Wilson, the open membership method of dealing with truth, if adopted, would greatly limit the needless multiplication of sects. Many sects have come into existence by the simple but mistaken process of giving to a truth a place for which it was not designed and upon which the New Testament is silent. Instead of vigorously emphasizing a particular doctrine, it has been made the basis for full fellowship. Thus, some secondary truth has often taken the place or usurped part of the place of the one foundation. Now, a statement like that is not going to go unanswered in the pages of the New Zealand Baptist. And in response, the Venerable J.T. Hinton, also a member of a long prominent family of Baptist theologians, raised a number of pragmatic objections. Meanwhile, the practice began to spread, inspired in part by Wanganui's startling growth under Wilson's ministry. The church moved from 103 to 185 in his first year. Palmerston North adopted open membership in July. Napier considered it, but rejected the move in October, with J.K. Archer, John, being uncharacteristically equivocal on the matter, not having an opinion. Debate simmered through 1909 and 1910, but gathered steam in 1911 with H. Knowles Kempton, an opponent, proposing in July that a session of Assembly be devoted to the issue. Now, interestingly, Wilson expressed misgiving about this, preferring calm written exchanges to open debate in a forum that, in any case, could not resolve the issue. And again, if we're talking about constitutions and so on, this is interesting to note. Were it possible to dispose of the subject by any resolution of Assembly, it would be a different case. Accentuated interest will result, but no finality can be arrived at. We must not forget that the Baptist Union has no legislative power over the churches, such as is allowed by the polity of some other communions. It is, after all, little more than an advisory board, which seeks to unite the churches in common efforts. The attempt to govern by an outside committee the self-governing churches, if pressed beyond a certain stage, would be fatal to the union's influence, if not its existence. Now, in the event, the debate did go ahead, and as the Assembly reporter noted, did not result in any conversions. The debate as recorded does, however, give us a range of responses, and notably for the first time from J.J. North. North, who, as we're all aware, became the dominant figure of the middle part of the 20th century, was in a process of metamorphosising from a young radical to a mature thinker, convinced by the value of denominational distinctives, and in particular Baptist ones. In 1901, even whilst advocating a more connectional polity, North could still say that congregationalism is true, but like other little truths, is liable to become false when it's unduly insisted on. There are bigoted Baptists. Fancy that. Any man who talks as though the doctrine of believers' baptism were the supreme thing in Christian doctrine is guilty of turning a truth into a destructive error. Now that's North in 1901. By 1911, he'd moved from such phrases as that, which Wilson might well have used, to a direct counter in the argument as reported that, quote, no church could make its door as wide as the kingdom. Christian liberty consisted in admitting that people who differ from us are disciples. All, however, must stand by what they believe. And for us, the gateway to the church is baptism. So, of course, the thing that turns on this question of open membership is, can you have people as members of your church, fully functioning members of your church, who are not baptised? And I come from an open membership church. The two churches I've pastored have been open membership churches. That wouldn't have been my choice, actually. But I'll be interested just to poll, how many of you who are aware of it are from open membership churches now? Yeah. Well, it's about half of our churches and more, I think, are now open membership. Very few of them were at this time, but they were becoming so. So if Davis offered an essentialist anthropological view and Wilson argued from an essentialist Christological position, North's argument shifted the ground. His was a strategic ecclesiological case, a pragmatic view that valued clarity of message and sought to avoid watering down the doctrine in the fear that, quote, open membership might result in an unbaptised church. And of course, this is a bit of a curiosity about Baptists and open membership. that in taking the view that we do, we are almost unique in Christendom to allow people as members who have no baptism of any sort. And that's a strange thing in Christendom. Now, it might be arguably the right thing, but it's nonetheless unusual. Well, Wilson's fear that debate at assembly might lead to disruptive bitterness wasn't completely unfounded, but further debate was discouraged as unhelpful, and the union didn't divide. Partisan arguments would erupt every now and again over the following years, but Wilson himself returned to Australia in 1912, and the outbreak of war gave Baptists other things to argue about. Nevertheless, there was a substantive skirmish in 1916 and again in 1919, featuring WMP Lascelles and F.H. Radford as key protagonists, with North, now himself editor of the New Zealand Baptist, evidently somewhat bored with a controversy that he had concluded only added heat to his version of Baptist light. The matter would surface again in the late 1920s with a now returned Wilson challenging North for using his editorial advantage to skew the debate. And he was almost certainly right on that when you look at the way in which North dealt with the matter in that period. But what we shouldn't miss is that this was a matter of significant dispute among churches. Both sides saw it as a matter of existential importance. The one felt that closed membership impeded the gospel. The other, that open membership might lead to the ruin of the Baptist cause, if not the entire church. This was a point of serious theological disagreement. It's not that stuff we argue about now, but it was then. And yet, and this is my main point, and yet it was not deemed necessary to require resolution of it in the 1920 Articles of Faith. Now, 1920, wasn't the Act of Incorporation 1923? Well, yes, most certainly. However, in June 1920, in preparation for what was anticipated, correctly, to be a slow process of presenting and passing a private bill in Parliament, a small committee was appointed to tidy up the Constitution and rules. Amendments were considered on the second day of the conference that year, 1920. They were energetically debated and duly passed. The reporter described it in typically colourful fashion. Ghosts were hunted with hatchets. Fresh phrases splendidly coined were carried to the satisfaction of malcontents, save and except when brutal majorities dished the malcontents. The changes to the Constitution were mostly structural, to do with the place of auxiliaries and officers of the Union, but unchanged in this process was Clause 3, which from its initial founding in 1882 had provided the sole guide to the creedal position of the Union. Clause 3. The Union fully recognises that every separate church has liberty to interpret and administer the laws of Christ, and that the immersion of believers is the only Christian baptism. Now, it's worth noting that in its sole creedal assertion, the Union at this point listed only two things: liberty, church liberty, and baptism as immersion of believers. Now, that was on the Friday of Assembly. Assemblies were long and interesting in those days. That was on the Friday. By the Monday, it having been recognised that this Clause 3 was a little bit thin for legislative purposes, an expanded creed had been devised and was adopted unanimously. The reporter for the New Zealand Baptist described it thus: "It hardly needs to be said here that we Baptists have no creed other than the Testament itself," and by that he means the New Testament. "We have an historic repugnance to creeds. We know what fetters man-made creeds have been. We know how conscience has been strained and how prevarication has been made easy by creeds. And so we've never had so much as a rag of a creed until this 1920 conference came along. But a creed became suddenly essential. We want to be incorporated so that our property and money willed to us may be properly handled. We cannot be incorporated without stating a creed of our church. Was ever such a fix?" A committee was set up consisting of Reverends Hercus, Kempton, Jenkin and North, and to their surprise, they arrived quite quickly at unanimous conclusions. That's largely because J.J. North gave them the answers. the legend is that J.J. North had it written out on the back of an envelope and said, "This is it, isn't it?" And they said yes, and they came back to comments. Well, here they are. And they are the ones that are still in the Act. The inspiration of the Bible, true humanity and deity of Lord Jesus Christ, the atonement, salvation by faith in Christ alone, membership in the Christian church for the regenerate, the immersion of believers is the only scriptural form of baptism. The reporter continues, they were proposed by the convener, J.J. North, adopted unanimously by the Assembly with applause and without debate. We need only add that these statements are as brief and as essential as an Act of Parliament requires. Now, for our purpose, the key clauses are 4, 5 and 6. Salvation by faith in Christ alone, membership in the Christian church for the regenerate, the immersion of believers is the only scriptural form of baptism. These articles of faith were agreed in a season in which the major controversy among New Zealand Baptists was the relation between baptism and church membership, a matter of existential importance to those on both sides. Yet that issue has no direct mention in the articles, and clauses 4 to 6 could have been endorsed by each of the main protagonists, whatever their position on the membership question. It seems clear, you see, that the framing of these brief and essential articles, and perhaps especially on the important point of difference, the general constitutional commitment to freedom prevailed. The pre-existing constitutional clause 3, that the Union fully recognises that every separate church has liberty to interpret and administer the laws of Christ and that the immersion of believers is the only Christian baptism, was not supplanted by the 6 articles. Indeed, the 1923 Act, when passed, included the articles as Schedule 1 and the Constitution and Rules as Schedule 2, with Clause 3 unchanged. Clause 3 remained, I would argue, the governing approach on matters of controversy. The articles were, as the reporters for the New Zealand Baptist implied, a pragmatic necessity, deliberately drawn up to include only those matters deemed beyond dispute. Now, the international context of these New Zealand events adds a further layer. In July 1923, the Third Baptist World Congress was held in Stockholm. J.J. North attended that. So this is 3 years after the events just described. But 1923, the key year for the Act itself. North attended this, and it was clearly a profound experience for him. He became more Baptist than ever. In fact, it was in the aftermath of the Congress that his famously aggressive statement on baptism became the masthead for the denominational magazine. He certainly didn't resile from his hard line on membership and baptism. But the impact of the Congress was broader than this. North's Stockholm syndrome included other just as critical elements of Baptist thought, and in particular, the relation between freedom and unity. At Stockholm, that American, E.Y. Mullins, had given the keynote address on the issues. North reported favourably on Mullins' speech and would go on to use Mullins' theological writings as foundational in his curriculum for the Baptist College. The principal statement from the Congress, crystallised by Mullins, was reproduced in the New Zealand Baptist in October 1923. It is a masterful distillation of the implications of Baptist ecclesiology. And its section on Christian unity concludes in this way. Christian unity is thus a flexible principle, adapting itself to every situation. It admits cooperation as far as there is agreement and abstains from all coercion beyond that point. In 1920-23, in the context of passionate disagreement on an important issue, this principle remained key. The New Zealand Baptist instinct for connection prevailed. The Articles of Faith were an expression of it rather than a retreat. It was a tacit confirmation of the view that creeds need not keep us apart. If necessary at all, they were to promote unity rather than to divide. And I think in the context of our debates this year and in other years leading up to this and on issues which divide us, which we have disagreements on, we can learn some principles of Baptist unity which come directly from our ecclesiological principles, and learn from some of the examples of people wrestling with these things 100 years ago. We don't have to repeat the past. As Mark Twain said, though, history never repeats, but it does echo. And I've been hearing the echoes in the last few days. So, thank you.
Kia koe, Martin, there was riveting stuff. Obviously some stuff for people to ponder. I guess we can take questions from the floor.
Yep.
So
Questions, comments and corrections.
Yeah.
Following is the Q&A session at the Sutherland Lecture breakfast. Note: the attendees were not close to the recording mic, and sound will be distorted at times.
I have a question.
Oh, there we go.
Yes.
Totally admitting my ignorance. Independent closed membership. Our constitution is believers' baptism is normally expected. And I understand that was because 37 years ago, somebody wanted to join and believe in infant baptism.
Yep.
So that's in the constitution.
Yep.
So that's
That would be counted as open membership. The proponents of open membership, Wilson particularly, still were vigorous advocates for baptism, for believers' baptism, and would often point to the fact that although they advocated for and were willing to accept those who were not baptised as believers or baptised at all, that almost all of the people who did come into membership were baptised because they emphasised the importance of it nonetheless. They just didn't want to make it a barrier. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could repeat, there's a line in your last paragraph about not an inclination towards coming together, but if you could repeat it, I thought it was...
Yep. So, in the context of passionate disagreement on an important issue, the principle of unity remained key. The New Zealand Baptist instinct for connection prevailed. The Articles of Faith were an expression of that rather than a retreat. Then it was a tacit confirmation of the view that creeds need not keep us apart. If necessary at all, they are to promote unity, not to divide.
Instinct for connection?
Yeah.
It's like a really phrase and something to sit with.
And certainly that's what I've observed in all my studies of New Zealand Baptist history, that even when individual churches split, the church somehow hangs in there. And we've had major disagreements within the denomination, but the denomination still hangs in there, and sometimes despite criminally minded ministers, and there's been one or two of them. Yeah.
It's not really a topic, but how much does this translate from denominational union to a local church? Those same principles.
Yeah. Well, according to Wilson and Mullins and even North, actually, it should translate it should be translating from the local church to the denomination. It should be found first in the local church, and that we are together because we are connected to the head. Yeah.
Martin, I've got a question here.
Yep.
Thanks for the person that used the system. Yeah, bless you. So using the definitions, first order, second order, both of those in quotation marks.
Yeah.
From Big Bite 1 reading.
Yep.
Pre-reading for the Hui.
Yes.
How did Baptists in the 1920s understand the issue of open/closed membership, and then in brackets, as first, question mark, second, question mark, question mark? Do you think they were right?
Oh. They definitely saw it as a second order issue, and that's why it's not in the statements of belief. Statements of belief include those sort of basic things that are creedal. The ones where you'd find in the Nicene Creed. The inspiration of the Bible, well, you wouldn't find that in the Nicene Creed, but that's fundamental. Incarnation, atonement, salvation by faith, membership for the regenerate, which is a very Baptist one. That's certainly seen as being crucial. and immersion as the only scriptural form of baptism. But the membership question was definitely seen as being a second order issue. And do I think they were right? Yes, I do. And I think that we've got to take seriously what Clause 3 then points us to, that on everything else, we've got to let the individual churches make their call. And that is an untidy thing. It takes a lot of explaining to people outside of us, but it's actually what we're about. And I've come to realise that untidy things are the best mission opportunity you can have, because they force you to explain, and you get the chance to tell the story. And so be untidy would be my parting gift.
Steve?
Yeah, Steve.
I guess the American impetus to, or whatever that word is, to soul competency, that kind of real individualistic. It kind of flies in the face of our focus then on instinct for connection in some ways.
Yeah, it does. So, yeah. And that's why I think the pure American Mullins soul competency thing never really took hold here. It was a much more corporate vision, a much more Christological vision of the type that Wilson and North came close to sharing. But although North's big thing was freedom. North is known of being anti-Catholic, but his reason for being anti-Catholic was that he felt that Catholics imposed belief onto individuals, and he thought that's the thing against which we fight, and he put open brethren in the same category. So he just saw them as two ends of the same, and they'd gone around the circle and ended up joining, because he saw them as forcing belief, rightly or wrongly. Apologies to all open brethren people here, but that was North's view, but never the pure individualism. So there were Baptist groups in America, for instance, which had their statement on ecclesiology was with something like this: that each man's church is the inside of his own hat. That basically you are your own church. Well, in the British Commonwealth tradition, that doesn't wash at all. Yeah.
Martin, we're obviously going to go through a constitutional review.
Yeah.
The Union talked about North and the envelope.
Yep.
Do you think it would be possible for us today to write what we believe is a union in the way he was able to back then?
I think it would be possible. It would be possible if you got just four people together to do it. If you tried to crowdsource it, people would have very different views about what's essential. So, we know from the debate on same-sex marriage, for instance, that there have been many who saw that as a first-order issue, and some have changed their church constitutions to require it. Some denominations have changed their constitutions to require it, to define marriage as marriage between a man and a woman. My view would be that simply can't be a first-order issue, because the only first-order issues that can exist are those that have an eternal referent, and there's no marrying in eternity. There's no sexuality in eternity. It's everything is transformed. It just can't be the sort of thing on which we base everything, whatever your view on it is.
Thanks, I appreciate your words. I was thinking about something Ben was just said around, the reformers had the solas and the glaring obvious ambitions, sola and ecclesia.
Yeah.
Kind of, that feeds in some ways back into first order, second order. It seems to me that Baptists don't want to put, ecclesial doctrine as first order, and so we're bound to the schism, but we try to stay together.
Yeah.
And there just seems to be, and maybe it's the enigma of Baptists.
Yeah. Well, it's why, and I puzzle this a little bit. That's why Clause 3 remained in the second schedule rather than the first schedule, because it's actually a negative statement. We're united by the fact that we don't agree. Yeah, and we're happy about not agreeing. So that's the guts of the ecclesiology, really, that the church has to allow for on the site flesh and blood decision, and not to impose theory over practice. Aye.
The older I've got, the more enthusiastic I've become about creedal statements.
You and JJ North together. Yeah.
So when I see creed or our Baptist Act of Incorporation, just because it says these are the non-negotiables, everything else is open for debate. If we can agree on these, then we can be in unity. Should I be kicked out of the denomination?
No, because we do have them. Yeah, but if the list is too big, then we start becoming not Baptists anymore. We start becoming Presbyterians.
But we need something.
Yeah. Oh yes. And there was never a suggestion that there's no non-negotiable belief. Yeah. And you know, Wilson would have been horrified at the notion that anything goes. And so his was a deeply Christological assertion, and that Christology was fundamental and non-negotiable. Yeah. But there is a bit of aging atrophy with us, Mike, which tends to point us in this direction. Yeah. Oh, Andrew. Yes.
Thank you. Great. And good to see the statement that's there. It's a pleasing minimum.
Yeah.
It's so helpful.
Yeah.
I think. I'd be interested to hear the kind of Biddy's comments around his point that the creeds were preceded by covenants.
Yeah.
The covenants played a more significant role in many senses, in terms of being on the communion table, in terms of the process of people initiated into the church. That the creeds were used in worship, but the covenant was. And so I think it supports what you're saying in terms of this connection being absolutely primary.
Yeah, I think I think that's less obvious in New Zealand than in Britain. My general impression of Paul Fedius's position on covenants is I think he slightly overstates the role of covenants, and I think there's an underlying dynamic, underlying way of thinking that precedes that even. But if you mean covenant by fundamental commitment one to the other, that connection becomes before conflict. Yes. Yeah. This is that. Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. They absolutely did. But what's in those covenants is often is statements of belief. Yeah. And so. I think connection is fundamentally important, and I'd agree with that as being prior. Yeah.
Any last takers?
Any last requests? Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah. Dr. John.
I would be thrilled, Martin, to hear some of your reflections as we anticipate, one of our next big bites.
Yeah.
This commitment to freedom of the local church, and with that, a generous evangelicalism. How we understand faith.
Yeah.
But what about practices to protect the most vulnerable in our communities? Any reflections on those?
Oh, yeah. I mean, those are the things that should be non-negotiable amongst us. And one. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so practices for protecting the vulnerable. I was in Australia in an Anglican setting when the Royal Commission on Institutional Abuse were reported in Australia. And it was just an unutterably appalling moment to hear that report to Anglican General Synod. And I'll tell you, this is for you, Daphne. There was on that day, there were two things happened. That there was had been a constitutional commitment 10 years earlier in the Anglican Synod to have all committees would become 50-50 men and women. And it was pointed out that they'd succeeded in 1 out of 20 in those 10 years. And then we get the report on child sexual abuse. And it struck me that those two things are related. That when you have men alone running things, the stuff we just don't see and prefer not to see. And women would see different things, and I don't think this would have happened in the same way. So individual church freedom cannot include destructive practices. But that is not just about children or children's safety. That's about spiritual abuse and all sorts of things. So the discussion around, getting alongside struggling churches, the assumption, as has been pointed out a few times, is always that it's the small ones you're talking about. I know plenty of big ones that have problems that need to be resolved, and they don't always recognise that they've got problems that are resolved because, if there was ever a move to remove some churches from the denomination on the basis of things that are not out in the 6 statements, I'd be first going to ask the question, well, hold on, what about the churches and how are they adhering to the first 6? And I think that we might find a few surprises.
Can we get a round of applause for that?